The fracture. The early autumn sun cast a golden glow across the manicured lawn of Brookstone Academy, a prestigious private school nestled on the edge of a sprawling suburban neighborhood. The air smelled of freshly cut grass, mingled with the faint tang of paint thinner wafting from the open windows of the art wing. Inside room 202, Miss Victoria Clark stood by the window, her hands wrapped around a ceramic mug of tea that had long gone cold. Her sharp eyes watched the students filing into the school courtyard, their chatter muffled by the thick glass panes. "Another year of self-absorbed teenagers," she muttered, turning back to her desk. Her workspace was a chaotic blend of paint palettes, half-used sketchbooks, and a precarious tower of critique notes. A neglected canvas leaned against the wall, a ghost of her abandoned artistic dreams. Once she had believed she would make her mark as an artist, her work gracing galleries across the country. But rejection after rejection had hardened her, turning her passion into bitterness. The shrill chime of the bell echoed through the hallways, signaling the start of her advanced art class. Students shuffled in, their designer shoes clicking against the polished linoleum. Victoria took a deep breath and straightened her posture, the practiced mask of professionalism sliding into place. "Welcome to advanced art," she announced, her voice crisp and commanding. "This is not a class for mediocrity. If you are here for easy grades or to diddle, I suggest transferring out now. In this room, we create art that matters." Her gaze swept over the room, taking in the mix of eager and apprehensive faces. Among them was a boy she hadn't seen before, sitting quietly in the back row. He was tall and lean, with smooth dark skin and neatly cropped hair. His uniform was immaculate, his notebook and pencils arranged with precision on the desk before him. "And your name?" Victoria's sharp voice cut through the hum of introductions. "Andrew Bennett," he replied, his voice steady but soft. He met her gaze briefly, his dark eyes calm and unreadable. She nodded curtly and turned to the front of the room, motioning to the large blank canvas on the easel. "Our first assignment is a self-expression piece. I want to see your heart on this canvas. Paint, draw, sculpt, whatever medium you choose, it must represent who you are. You have 1 week." The class murmured as they began unpacking their supplies, their movements filled with the nervous energy of a new term. Andrew, however, sat quietly for a moment, his gaze fixed on the empty canvas, as if seeing something no one else could. Victoria noticed but said nothing. She had long ago learned that talent wasn't always loud. Sometimes it spoke in whispers, a spark of intrigue. By the middle of the week, most students had begun sketching outlines or blending the first layers of paint. Victoria made her rounds, offering curt feedback and occasionally correcting techniques. When she reached Andrew's desk, she stopped short. His canvas was unlike anything she had seen in years. A sprawling urban scene unfolded under his careful brushstrokes, vibrant and teeming with life. Each building seemed to hum with its own energy, the windows reflecting stories within. Figures danced across the streets and walls, their emotions conveyed through expressive postures and faces. The color palette was bold but balanced, with warm tones giving way to shadows that hinted at deeper meaning. "This is ambitious," Victoria said, her tone laced with skepticism. "What's your inspiration?" Andrew glanced up briefly, his hands still moving. "My mom," he said simply. Before she could press for more, the bell rang, and the students began packing up. Victoria stayed behind, her eyes lingering on Andrew's painting. The raw talent was undeniable, but something about the piece nagged at her. The precision, the complexity. It seemed too advanced for a high school student. The critique. The following week, the class gathered for their first critique session. The room buzzed with anticipation as each student displayed their work. Victoria saved Andrew's piece for last, the large canvas propped on the easel at the front of the room. As the class murmured in awe, Victoria felt a familiar pang of jealousy. She couldn't deny the brilliance of the work, but her insecurities whispered dark thoughts. "Impressive," she said aloud, her voice cutting through the room. "But it raises some questions." Andrew's posture stiffened slightly, but he held her gaze. "These techniques," she continued, stepping closer to the painting. "The layering, the texture, it's almost too polished. Who helped you?" The room fell silent, the weight of her accusation settling heavily in the air. "No one," Andrew replied, his voice steady but firm. "I've been painting since I was a kid. My mom taught me." Victoria's jaw tightened. "Is that so?" She turned back to the class, her tone icy. "In art, authenticity is everything. If you didn't create this entirely on your own, you're doing yourself and this class a disservice." Andrew didn't respond, but the hurt in his eyes was unmistakable. He walked back to his seat, leaving the painting behind on the easel. Victoria dismissed the class shortly after, but as she cleaned up the room, she couldn't shake the image of Andrew's work, or the quiet dignity in his voice. A seed of doubt. That evening, Victoria sat in her small apartment, staring at her own unfinished canvas. The memory of Andrew's painting loomed in her mind, a reminder of the brilliance she had once strived for, but never quite achieved. Her fingers itched to paint, but as she reached for her brush, doubt crept in. What if she had been wrong about Andrew? What if his work was exactly as genuine as he claimed? Pushing the thoughts aside, she picked up the brush and began to paint, hoping to drown her insecurities in color. Torn and tethered, the hum of chatter in the art room was subdued the next day. Students exchanged uneasy glances, their usual banter muted by the tension that lingered from the previous critique session. Andrew sat quietly in the back of the room, his hands folded neatly on the desk, his canvas conspicuously absent. Victoria Clark entered the classroom with her usual brisk authority, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Yet, for the first time in years, she felt an unfamiliar weight settle in her chest. She avoided Andrew's gaze, but she could feel it, steady, calm, unyielding. "We're moving on to landscapes today," she announced, her voice louder than necessary. "Focus on depth and contrast. Use your light and shadows wisely." The students began their work, pencils scratching softly against paper, brushes sweeping in delicate strokes. Victoria moved among them, offering her usual blend of constructive criticism and sharp observations. When she reached Andrew's desk, she hesitated. "Where's your canvas?" she asked, her tone clipped. "I left it at home," Andrew replied, not looking up. Victoria frowned, unsure how to respond. The boy's quiet defiance unsettled her. "You'll need it for your portfolio," she said, her voice softening despite herself. He nodded but said nothing more, returning to his sketch as if the conversation were over. The fracture deepens. The following week, Andrew submitted a new piece for the class. It was smaller, less intricate than his previous work, but still striking. A narrow alleyway stretched into the distance, illuminated by the warm glow of streetlights. The shadows danced with hints of movement, suggesting stories hidden within the darkness. The class murmured their approval, but Victoria's critical eye searched for faults. She pointed to the edges of the piece, where the brushstrokes seemed less refined. "You've lost some precision here," she said, tapping the edge of the canvas. "It feels rushed." Andrew's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. "I'll work on it," he said simply. As the class filed out at the end of the period, Marisol, one of the more outspoken students, lingered near Andrew's desk. "I don't know why she's so hard on you," she whispered. "Your work's incredible." Andrew gave her a small smile, but his eyes remained guarded. "She's just doing her job," he replied, his voice calm but distant. Marisol frowned but said nothing more, retreating to the door with a final glance over her shoulder. Victoria watched the exchange from her desk, her hands clenched tightly around a stack of papers. She told herself it was professionalism driving her critique of Andrew's work, but deep down she knew better. His talent terrified her. The breaking point. 2 weeks later, the class gathered for another critique session. Andrew's new piece, A mural design depicting a vibrant community garden took center stage. The colors were rich and inviting, the composition expertly balanced. Flowers seemed to bloom from the canvas, their petals glowing with an inner light. Victoria approached the painting slowly, her eyes narrowing as she took in the details. "This is better," she said, her voice measured. "But the concept feels derivative. Where's the originality?" Andrew stared at her, his expression unreadable. "It's inspired by the garden my mom used to tend," he said. "She believed in creating spaces where people could connect." "Perhaps you're relying too much on your mother's legacy," Victoria replied, her tone cold. "Art should be about forging your own path, not recreating someone else's." The room fell silent, the other students watching with wide eyes. Andrew's hands clenched at his sides, his calm facade cracking. "With all due respect, Miss Clark," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "you don't know anything about my path." Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Andrew picked up his painting and walked out of the room. The door closed behind him with a resounding thud, leaving the class stunned. The unexpected call. That evening, Victoria sat in her apartment, replaying the confrontation in her mind. Her frustration with Andrew, her envy of his talent, it all twisted inside her like a knot she couldn't untangle. Her thoughts were interrupted by the shrill ring of her phone. She hesitated before answering, her heart sinking when she saw the school's number. "Miss Clark, this is Principal Hargrove," the familiar voice said, calm but firm. "We need to talk about an incident involving Andrew Bennett." Victoria's stomach dropped. "What about it?" she asked, though she already knew. "His father called," Principal Hargrove continued. "He's concerned about how Andrew's been treated in your class. I'd like to meet with you and Mr. Bennett tomorrow morning to discuss this further." Victoria's grip on the phone tightened. "Of course," she said, her voice strained. After hanging up, she sank onto her couch, her head in her hands. The weight of her actions pressed down on her, suffocating in its intensity. The confrontation. The next morning, Victoria arrived at the principal's office early, her nerves frayed. She sat stiffly in the waiting area, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When the door opened, Andrew entered with a tall, imposing man she recognized immediately. Malcolm Bennett, one of the school's most influential donors, exuded an air of quiet authority. His tailored suit and steady gaze only added to his commanding presence. "Miss Clark," he said, his voice calm but firm, "shall we?" Inside the office, the conversation was tense. Malcolm Bennett wasted no time addressing his concerns, his words sharp and precise. "My son has always spoken highly of his teachers," he said, "but lately he's been coming home questioning his abilities, doubting himself. That's not the Andrew I know." Victoria swallowed hard, her chest tight with shame. "I may have been overly critical," she admitted. Malcolm's gaze softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. "Andrew has an extraordinary gift. He doesn't need someone tearing him down. He needs a mentor who can help him grow." Victoria nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I understand." As the meeting ended, Malcolm leaned closer, his expression unreadable. "This isn't just about Andrew," he said quietly. "It's about you too. Figure out why you're so afraid of his talent, then do better." Victoria left the office feeling both chastened and determined. She couldn't change the past, but maybe, just maybe, she could make things right. A second chance. That afternoon, Victoria waited for Andrew outside the art room. When he arrived, she met his guarded gaze with a hesitant smile. "Andrew, can we talk?" she asked. He hesitated before nodding, stepping into the room. Victoria took a deep breath. "I owe you an apology," she began. "I've been unfair to you, and it has nothing to do with your work. It's my own insecurities getting in the way. Your talent, it's incredible, and instead of supporting you, I let my jealousy get the better of me." Andrew studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. Why now? Because I realized I was wrong, she said simply, and because I want to do better. If you'll let me, I'd like to help you with your next project, not as a critic, but as a mentor. Andrew's eyes softened, and for the first time, a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Okay, he said quietly. Victoria felt a weight lift from her shoulders. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. The canvas of trust. The art room buzzed with quiet energy as the late afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting warm, golden light across the room. Andrew sat at his usual desk, his sketchpad open in front of him, pencil in hand. The soft scratch of graphite on paper filled the silence, punctuated only by the faint hum of the air conditioner. Victoria Clark stood at the front of the room, organizing a stack of art supplies she brought in for the mentorship sessions. Despite her outward composure, her nerves hummed with an unfamiliar tension. This was her first attempt at rebuilding the bridge she had so carelessly burned with Andre. Before we start, she began, turning to face him. I want to thank you for giving me this chance. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm committed to helping you. No hidden agendas, just you and your art. Andrew didn't look up immediately, his pencil moving in slow, deliberate strokes across the page. Finally, he nodded, a barely perceptible gesture that carried more weight than any words could have. I guess we'll see, he said simply, his tone neither hostile nor warm. Victoria swallowed hard, acknowledging the uphill battle ahead. All right, she said, clasping her hands together. Let's see what you've got so far. A collaborative effort. Andrew slid his sketchpad across the desk, revealing a rough concept for a mural. The design was intricate, depicting an urban scene infused with nature. Vines creeping up the sides of skyscrapers, flowers blooming through cracks in the pavement, and a vibrant sunset casting everything in a golden glow. It's about resilience, Andrew explained, his voice steady. How life finds a way, even in the harshest places. Victoria's eyes roamed over the design, her critical mind kicking into gear. The composition was strong, and the concept was deeply moving, but there was room for refinement. This is beautiful, she said, her voice tinged with genuine admiration. The contrast between the man-made and the organic elements is striking. But she hesitated, unsure if he would accept her critique. But what? Andrew prompted, his tone neutral but curious. These buildings here, she said, pointing to the foreground. They feel too rigid compared to the fluidity of the vines and flowers. Maybe soften the edges, make them look like they're being embraced by the nature around them. Andrew considered her suggestion, his gaze thoughtful. That could work, he said after a moment. Victoria smiled, a small flicker of hope sparking within her. Let's try it. Then. The next hour passed in a surprising rhythm of collaboration. Andrew worked methodically, his pencil moving with confidence, while Victoria offered occasional feedback. She noticed how his demeanor shifted as they worked, his initial wariness giving way to a quiet focus that reminded her of why she had become an art teacher in the first place. Do you ever paint anymore? Andrew asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Victoria froze, her hand stilling over the paintbrushes she'd been sorting. Not in a long time, she admitted, her voice tinged with regret. Why not? She hesitated, the question striking deeper than she expected. I guess I lost the passion for it, she said finally. Or maybe I was just afraid to fail again. Andrew nodded, his expression unreadable. That's too bad, he said softly, returning to his sketch. The challenge. As the session drew to a close, Andrew leaned back in his chair, studying his revised sketch. I think this is starting to come together, he said, his tone more relaxed than it had been in weeks. Victoria nodded, pride swelling in her chest. It's incredible, Andrew. I can't wait to see it on a larger scale. He glanced at her, a flicker of something. Trust, perhaps, crossing his face. What about you? He asked. What about me? You should paint something too, he said, his voice calm but firm. If you're going to mentor me, you should lead by example. The suggestion caught her off guard, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. Andrew, this is about you, not me, she said finally. I know, he replied, his gaze steady. But maybe it's about both of us. You said you lost the passion for it. Maybe it's time to find it again. Victoria felt her throat tighten, the weight of his words pressing against her chest. He was right, of course. She had spent so long running from her own art, from her own insecurities, that she had forgotten what it felt like to create. All right, she said softly. But I'm holding you to the same standard. You have to be honest with me about my work. No holding back. Andrew's lips quirked into a faint smile. Deal. The unveiling. Over the next few weeks, the art room became a haven of creativity and collaboration. Andrew worked tirelessly on his mural design, refining every detail until it captured the full depth of his vision. Victoria, true to her word, began painting again. Her first attempts were tentative, her brushstrokes hesitant and uncertain. But as the days passed, she found herself rediscovering the joy of creation. Her canvas slowly transformed into a vibrant landscape, filled with bold colors and dynamic movement, a reflection of her own journey back to the artist she had once been. Andrew watched her progress with quiet interest, occasionally offering suggestions or encouragement. Their roles shifted fluidly, teacher and student learning from each other in a way that felt natural and unforced. Finally, the day came for Andrew to present his finished mural design to the principal and the school board. The art room buzzed with anticipation as he set up his work, his hands steady despite the weight of expectation. When he unveiled the piece, a collective gasp filled the room. The mural was breathtaking, a celebration of resilience and growth, infused with both personal emotion and universal themes. The judges praised his work, their admiration evident in their glowing remarks. As Andrew accepted their accolades, Victoria stood quietly at the back of the room, her heart swelling with pride. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of purpose and fulfillment that went beyond her own ambitions. The connection. After the presentation, Andrew approached her, his expression softer than she had ever seen. "Thanks for helping me," he said simply. Victoria shook her head, her eyes misty. "No, Andrew. Thank you for helping me." They stood in silence for a moment, the unspoken understanding between them deeper than words. In that moment, they were no longer teacher and student, but two artists on parallel journeys, each finding their way back to the light. Fractures and foundations. The art room was alive with a quiet energy, a sanctuary untouched by the noise and drama that echoed through the hallways of Brookstone Academy. Andrew's mural project had reached the point where it needed to transition from sketches to a full-scale canvas. The vibrant energy of his smaller designs demanded a larger stage, a place where his vision could expand and breathe. "Are you ready?" Victoria asked, watching as Andrew carefully unrolled the blank canvas across the far wall of the art room. Andrew stepped back, inspecting the expanse of white with a critical eye. "Ready as I'll ever be," he said, though his voice carried a trace of uncertainty. Victoria noticed it, the subtle tightness in his jaw, the way his hands lingered on the edges of the canvas as though grounding himself. "You don't have to do this all at once," she offered. "It's okay to take it step by step." Andrew turned to her, his expression firm. "No," he said quietly. "I need to do this. It's not just a project. It's something I owe her." Victoria nodded, understanding the weight he carried. Over the past weeks, she had learned more about Andrew's late mother, a community artist who had poured her soul into murals that told stories of resilience and hope. Her influence lived in every brushstroke Andrew made, every detail he painstakingly added to his designs. "Then let's start," she said, pulling a palette from the supply shelf and placing it on the worktable. "But remember, Andrew, it's okay to let it be yours too, not just hers." The first strokes. Andrew dipped his brush into a pot of deep cobalt blue, the color rich and striking against the stark white of the canvas. His movements were steady, deliberate, as he painted the first sweeping lines of the cityscape that would serve as the foundation of his mural. Victoria watched from a distance, her own easel set up nearby. She had taken his challenge seriously, throwing herself into a new painting that explored her own fractured relationship with art. Her canvas was smaller than Andrew's, but it reflected something equally expansive. A landscape of broken shards and glimmers of light, a visual diary of her journey back to creativity. "Why do you always start with blue?" she asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Andrew paused, glancing at her. "It's grounding," he said after a moment. "It's like the foundation of everything else. My mom always said blue was where the story began." Victoria smiled, filing the comment away. She hadn't intended to learn from him, but his insights often struck chords she hadn't realized were still raw. As the hours passed, the mural began to take shape. Buildings rose from the canvas, their lines precise but softened by the vines and flowers that wove through them. The sun, a vibrant orb of orange and gold, glowed from the horizon, its light spilling into every corner of the scene. "You've got a good balance here," Victoria said, stepping closer to inspect his work. "But don't be afraid to let the natural elements take over more. The tension between order and chaos is what makes it interesting." Andrew nodded, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Good tension," he murmured, as if testing the phrase on his tongue. A tense encounter. As they worked, the art room door creaked open, and Marisol poked her head inside. "Hey, Miss Clark, Principal Hargrove wants to see you in her office." Victoria stiffened, the memory of her last meeting with the principal flashing through her mind. "Now?" she asked. Marisol nodded. She said it's about the mural. Victoria glanced at Andrew, who was still focused on his work, his brush moving in confident strokes. "I'll be back soon," she told him, before heading out. The walk to the principal's office felt longer than usual, each step echoing ominously in the empty hallway. When she entered, she was surprised to find not only Principal Hargrove, but also Malcolm Bennett seated across from her desk. "Miss Clark," Principal Hargrove began, her expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Bennett has expressed some concerns about the progress of Andrew's project." Victoria's stomach tightened. Concerns. Malcolm's gaze was sharp, his tone measured. "My son has a lot riding on this mural," he said. "It's not just a school project. It's a way to honor his mother's legacy. I want to make sure he's getting the support he needs." Victoria bristled at the implied criticism. "With all due respect, Mr. Bennett, Andrew is more than capable of handling this project. He doesn't need me to carry him." "Maybe not," Malcolm replied, leaning forward. "But he does need someone who believes in him. Someone who isn't just going through the motions." The words stung, and Victoria felt her cheeks flush. She wanted to defend herself, to argue that she had poured her heart into mentoring Andrew. But as she opened her mouth, she realized Malcolm wasn't entirely wrong. "I'll make sure he succeeds," she said instead, her voice steady. Malcolm studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Good," he said, "because this mural isn't just about Andrew. It's about what he represents, for this school, for this community. Don't let him down." A private breakthrough. When Victoria returned to the art room, she found Andrew cleaning his brushes, his shoulders hunched with exhaustion. The mural had grown in her absence, the natural elements spilling over the edges of the cityscape in a vibrant display of life and growth. "Long meeting?" Andrew asked without looking up. Victoria hesitated before answering. "Your dad's very invested in your work," she said carefully. Andrew snorted, setting his brushes aside. "Yeah, that's one way to put it. Is that a problem?" Andrew shrugged, his movements slow and deliberate. "It's just a lot of pressure. Sometimes I feel like I'm painting for him, not for me." Victoria's chest tightened. She understood that feeling all too well, the weight of expectations, the fear of disappointing someone who mattered. "You know," she said softly, "your work doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be honest." Andrew looked at her, something unspoken passing between them. For the first time, she saw the cracks in his composure, the vulnerability he usually kept hidden. "What if my honest isn't good enough?" he asked quietly. Victoria reached for one of his discarded brushes, holding it out to him. "Then you keep painting," she said, "because honest is always good enough." Andrew took the brush, his grip firm but his hands trembling slightly. "Thanks, Miss Clark," he said after a moment, his voice barely above a whisper. The next step. Over the following days, Andrew threw himself into his work with renewed determination. The mural became a living, breathing entity, its details evolving with each stroke of his brush. Victoria watched from the sidelines, stepping in only when he sought her guidance. Meanwhile, her own painting began to take on new life. The fractured shards she had initially painted started to connect, their edges softening as she added layers of light and color. It was a slow process, but with each stroke, she felt a piece of herself returning. One evening, as they packed up for the day, Andrew glanced at her canvas. "That's looking good," he said, a rare note of approval in his voice. Victoria smiled, feeling a warmth she hadn't experienced in years. "Thanks, Andrew. I think we're both finding our way back." He nodded, a small but genuine smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah," he said, "I think we are." Shadows and light. Andrew stood before the mural, the expanse of the canvas stretching across the wall like an untold story. The colors glowed under the art room's warm lights, but he still saw imperfections. The vines creeping over the skyscrapers felt too forced in some sections, the balance between nature and urban life not yet fully realized. He turned his brush in his hand, staring at the incomplete details, his mind racing with ways to bring cohesion to the piece. Victoria Clark watched him from her desk. For weeks, she had observed Andrew pour himself into the mural with a focus and determination that rivaled her own years as a budding artist. Yet today, there was a hesitation in his movements, a stiffness she hadn't seen before. "You're stuck," she said finally, breaking the silence. Andrew sighed, setting the brush down on the tray with a quiet clink. "It's not working," he muttered. "The vines. They're too chaotic." Victoria stood and walked over, her heels clicking softly against the linoleum. She studied the mural, her trained eye tracing the flow of the design. "It's not chaos," she said after a moment. "It's life. You're letting the vines do what they're supposed to grow. Maybe it feels wrong because you're trying to control them too much." Andrew frowned, his eyes narrowing. "But it has to mean something. If I let it all go wild, it'll lose the message." "Does it?" she asked, tilting her head. "Or will it tell a different story? One you didn't plan for, but one that's still true?" Her words hung in the air, and Andrew's gaze softened as he considered them. He picked up the brush again, the bristles coated in a deep green. With a slow, deliberate stroke, he added to the vines, letting them flow freely over the edges of the buildings. The sharp lines of the cityscape softened, the organic shapes blending into the urban backdrop. "There," Victoria said, stepping back. "See how the balance shifts? It's alive now." Andrew nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Yeah," he said softly. "It feels right. A shared history." As they worked side by side, Victoria found herself reflecting on her own struggles with art. The mural brought back memories of her first major project, a sprawling abstract piece she had poured her soul into during her final year of art school. It had been ambitious, daring, and deeply personal. She remembered the thrill of creating it, the long nights spent in her tiny studio, and the exhilaration of seeing it complete. And then she remembered the critique. Her professor, a renowned artist with a reputation for ruthless honesty, had torn into her work with words that still echoed in her mind. "Derivative. Lacks originality. You're imitating others instead of finding your own voice." Those words had been a blow she hadn't recovered from. sending her spiraling into self-doubt and ultimately abandoning her dream of being an artist. "Miss Clark." Andrew's voice broke through her thoughts, pulling her back to the present. She blinked, realizing she had been staring at the mural without really seeing it. "Sorry," she said, shaking her head. "I was just thinking." "About what?" Victoria hesitated, then decided to be honest. "About a mural I painted years ago. It was supposed to be my breakthrough piece, the one that launched my career, but when it was critiqued, it broke me." Andrew looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "What happened?" "My professor said it wasn't original, that I was just copying other artists," she said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "I let his words define me. I stopped painting after that." Andrew was silent for a moment, then said, "That's why you were so hard on me, isn't it? You were afraid I'd be better than you." The words stung, but they were true. Victoria nodded, her throat tight. "Yes," she admitted, "but it wasn't just that. Seeing your work reminded me of everything I'd lost. I let my jealousy and fear cloud my judgment. And I'm sorry for that." Andrew's expression softened, and he nodded. "It's okay," he said. "You're helping me now. That matters." A sudden setback. 2 days later, disaster struck. Victoria arrived at the art room early to prep for her own work session, but stopped short when she saw Andrew standing in front of the mural, his posture tense. Paint cans and brushes were scattered across the floor, some tipped over and spilling their contents onto the canvas. The vibrant colors of the mural were smeared with streaks of black and gray, the result of a careless, or perhaps malicious, hand. "What happened?" Victoria asked, her voice sharp with alarm. Andrew turned to her, his jaw tight. "Someone trashed it," he said, his voice low but simmering with anger. "I came in this morning, and it was like this." Victoria felt a surge of anger and protectiveness. "Who would do this?" "I don't know," Andrew said, running a hand through his hair. "But it doesn't matter. The mural's ruined." "No," Victoria said firmly, stepping closer to examine the damage. "It's not ruined. It's just a new challenge." Andrew gave her a skeptical look. "A challenge?" "Yes," she said, her tone resolute. "You've faced worse than this, Andrew. You've already shown you can create something incredible. This is just another opportunity to prove it." He stared at the mural, his hands clenched at his sides. "What if I can't fix it?" Victoria placed a hand on his shoulder, meeting his gaze. "You don't have to fix it. You just have to make it yours again." Rebuilding the vision. With Victoria's encouragement, Andrew began the painstaking process of salvaging the mural. They worked together for hours, scraping away the dried black paint and blending new colors over the damaged sections. What had once been sharp and polished now took on a raw, textured quality, a testament to resilience and adaptation. "This actually works," Andrew said after a while, his voice tinged with surprise. "The imperfections, they add something." Victoria smiled, her own brush moving in tandem with his. "Art isn't about perfection," she said. "It's about finding beauty in the unexpected." As the mural transformed, so did their relationship. The tension that had once defined their interactions dissolved, replaced by mutual respect and trust. Andrew began seeking Victoria's advice more freely, and she, in turn, found herself learning from his boldness and creativity. By the time they finished for the day, the mural was no longer just a reflection of Andrew's vision. It was a collaboration, a fusion of their strengths and vulnerabilities. "It's different," Andrew said, stepping back to admire their work. "But I think it's better." Victoria nodded, her heart swelling with pride. "I think so too." A silent triumph. A week later, the mural was unveiled to the school. The students and faculty gathered in the art wing, their voices a hum of anticipation as the cloth covering the mural was pulled away. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the vibrant, textured masterpiece was revealed. The mural was a celebration of life and resilience, its imperfections adding depth and character that spoke to the struggles and triumphs behind its creation. The vines and flowers seemed to pulse with energy, intertwining with the cityscape in a dance of harmony and tension. Andrew stood at the center of the room, his face a mix of pride and humility as the crowd erupted into applause. Victoria watched from the sidelines, her chest tight with emotion. This was his moment, and he had earned every bit of it. When the crowd began to disperse, Andrew approached her, his smile genuine. "Thank you," he said simply. Victoria shook her head, her own smile soft but warm. "No, Andrew. Thank you for reminding me why art matters." Redemption in the frame. The applause from the mural unveiling had faded hours ago, but echoes of the celebration lingered in Victoria Clark's mind as she sat alone in the art room. The mural, now a permanent fixture on the wall, stood as a testament to resilience, creativity, and the unlikely bond she had formed with Andrew. The colors glowed softly in the dim evening light, a quiet reminder of what they had achieved together. But even as pride swelled in her chest, doubts whispered in her mind. Was it enough? Could she truly redeem herself for the pain she had caused him at the start of the year? The answer came unexpectedly the next morning when she found a small envelope tucked under her door. It was unmarked, save for her name scrawled in bold, familiar handwriting. Inside was a note. "Miss Clark, I think it's time you showed your work. See you at the showcase. Andrew." She stared at the words, her pulse quickening. The school's annual art showcase was only 2 weeks away, a prestigious event attended by students, faculty, and community members alike. She had encouraged her students to participate every year, but she had never once considered entering her own work. Now, Andrew was challenging her to do just that. A reluctant beginning. For days, Victoria wrestled with the idea. Her unfinished painting, a fractured landscape that reflected her journey back to art, sat untouched in her studio at home. Every time she picked up her brush, she hesitated, paralyzed by the fear of judgment that had haunted her since her art school days. "You're overthinking it," Andrew said one afternoon as they cleaned up after a session. He had stayed late to help her organize supplies, a gesture that had become common in recent weeks. Victoria glanced at him, her brow furrowed. "It's not that simple," she replied. "Putting my work out there again. It feels like opening an old wound." Andrew set down the brushes he had been washing and looked at her. "You told me that art doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be honest. So why are you holding yourself to a different standard?" The question struck her like a bolt of lightning. She had spent months urging Andrew to embrace his imperfections, to find beauty in the flaws of his work. Yet here she was, clinging to the very fears she had warned him against. "You're right," she said finally, her voice quiet but resolute. "I've been a hypocrite. It's time to change that." The unveiling of her past. In the days leading up to the showcase, Victoria poured herself into her painting with a fervor she hadn't felt in years. The fractured landscape began to take on new life, its jagged edges softened by layers of light and shadow. The colors were bold yet harmonious, each stroke a step toward healing. As she worked, memories of her art school days bubbled to the surface. She remembered the critiques, the praise she had once received, and the crushing dismissal that had driven her away from painting. But for the first time, those memories felt distant, like echoes from another life. They no longer held power over her. Instead, she focused on the present, on the lessons she had learned from Andrew and her students, on the joy of creating for the sake of creation. Each brushstroke was a declaration. "I am still an artist." When the day of the showcase arrived, Victoria arrived at the auditorium early, carrying her finished painting with trembling hands. The space buzzed with activity as students and teachers set up their displays, the air thick with anticipation. Andrew was already there, his mural design prominently featured on one of the walls. He smiled when he saw her, a quiet look of encouragement passing between them. "Where's yours?" he asked. Victoria gestured to the wrapped canvas in her hands. "I'm still deciding where to put it." Andrew laughed softly. "You mean you're still deciding if you'll put it up?" She sighed, but his teasing tone eased her nerves. "Maybe." "Just do it," he said. "You've got this." With his words echoing in her mind, she found an empty easel near the center of the room and carefully unwrapped her painting. As she secured it in place, she stepped back, her heart pounding. The fractured landscape stared back at her, its vibrant shards of light and color seeming to hum with life. The showcase. By the time the showcase opened, the auditorium was packed with visitors. Parents, teachers, and community members wandered from display to display, their voices a soft hum of admiration and curiosity. Victoria stayed near the back, watching nervously as people stopped to view her painting. She couldn't hear their comments, but their reactions spoke volumes. Some tilted their heads, studying the piece with thoughtful expressions. Others murmured to one another, their gestures animated as they pointed out details. And then, to her surprise, Andrew approached with his father. Malcolm Bennett's sharp gaze softened as he took in her painting. "This is yours?" he asked, his tone curious. Victoria nodded, her throat tight. "Yes, it's remarkable," he said after a moment, stepping closer to examine the details. "There's pain in this piece, but also hope. It feels honest." The words struck her deeply, and she blinked back tears. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Andrew grinned, his pride for her unmistakable. "Told you it'd be good." The ripple effect. By the end of the evening, Victoria had spoken to dozens of people about her painting. Some asked about her technique, while others shared how the piece had moved them. Each conversation chipped away at the walls she had built around herself, leaving her feeling lighter than she had in years. When the showcase ended, Andrew lingered as the crowd dispersed, helping her pack up her supplies. As they worked, he looked at her painting one last time. "You know," he said, "this could be the start of something new for you." Victoria smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Maybe it is. The future beckons." In the weeks that followed, the mural and Victoria's painting became symbols of change at Brookstone Academy. Students and faculty alike spoke of the transformative power of art, of the way it could bring people together and heal wounds. For Victoria, the journey was far from over. She continued teaching, but she also began painting again, this time without fear. Each new piece was a step forward, a reminder that redemption wasn't a destination but a process. And for Andrew, the mural was just the beginning. His work caught the attention of local artists and gallery owners, opening doors he hadn't dared to dream of. But no matter how far he went, he never forgot the lessons he had learned in that small art room. One day, as they worked on a new project together, Andrew turned to Victoria and said, "You're more than a teacher, you know. You're an artist." Victoria smiled, her brush pausing mid-stroke. "And so are you." In that moment, the fractured pieces of their journey came together, forming something whole, something beautiful, closing the circle. The months following the art showcase were transformative, not only for Andrew and Victoria, but for the entire Brookstone Academy. The mural became more than a work of art. It became a symbol of resilience, growth, and the healing power of creativity. Students from all grades stopped by to admire it, their fingers tracing the vibrant lines and textures as if trying to absorb the energy it exuded. For Andrew, life began to shift in unexpected ways. The mural garnered attention beyond the school, with local artists and community leaders inviting him to speak at events and collaborate on projects. One day, a gallery owner stopped by the school to view the mural in person and offered Andrew a spot in an upcoming youth art exhibition. "You're not just talented," the gallery owner told him. "You have a voice, and the world needs to hear it." Victoria watched from the sidelines, her heart swelling with pride. Andrew's success was undeniable, and she was grateful to have played a part in his journey. Yet as she watched him grow, she found herself reflecting on her own path. A new challenge, One evening, as Victoria worked late in the art room, Andrew walked in, holding a portfolio under his arm. He placed it on the desk in front of her without a word, his expression a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "What's this?" she asked, flipping open the portfolio. "An application for the National Young Artists Fellowship," Andrew said. "It's a huge opportunity, a chance to study with professional artists and work on projects that could make a real difference. But I need a recommendation letter." Victoria's breath caught in her throat. The fellowship was one of the most prestigious programs in the country, and only the best young artists were accepted. But as she flipped through his portfolio, she had no doubt that Andrew belonged among them. "You don't need me to tell them how talented you are," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Your work speaks for itself." Andrew smiled, but there was a vulnerability in his eyes. "I still need your support, Miss Clark. You're the one who pushed me to take this seriously." Victoria nodded, her chest tight. "You'll have your letter," she said, "and I'll make sure they know exactly how incredible you are." The final step. As Andrew prepared his submission, Victoria found herself facing a challenge of her own. Inspired by his courage, she decided to revisit her own dreams. For years, she had avoided applying to juried exhibitions, fearing the rejection that had once shattered her confidence. But now, with Andrew's encouragement echoing in her mind, she decided it was time to take a leap. "I'm entering too," she told Andrew one afternoon as they packed up after a session. "There's a local exhibition for emerging and re-emerging artists. It feels fitting." Andrew's grin was wide and genuine. "About time," he said. "I've been waiting for you to do this." They spent the next few weeks working side by side. Andrew polishing his submission for the fellowship, Victoria creating a new piece for the exhibition. Their dynamic had shifted. While Victoria remained the mentor, Andrew had become a source of inspiration for her, a reminder that it was never too late to start again. The announcement. The day of the fellowship announcement arrived with an air of anticipation. Andrew sat in the art room with Victoria, his phone clutched tightly in his hand as they waited for the email. When the notification finally arrived, he hesitated, his fingers trembling. "Go on," Victoria urged, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. Andrew opened the email, his eyes scanning the words. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. "I got in," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I got in." Victoria let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Of course you did," she said, pulling him into a rare hug. "You earned it." The news spread quickly, and the entire school celebrated Andrew's achievement. But for Victoria, the true reward was seeing the joy and confidence radiating from him. He was no longer the quiet, guarded boy who had walked into her classroom months ago. He was an artist, ready to take on the world. The exhibition. A month later, Victoria stood in the middle of a bustling gallery, surrounded by her peers and patrons of the arts. Her painting, a bold, abstract exploration of light and shadow, hung prominently on the wall, drawing admiring glances and thoughtful comments from those who passed by. Andrew arrived halfway through the evening, fresh from another event celebrating his fellowship. He approached her with a wide grin, his eyes shining with pride. "You did it," he said, gesturing to her painting. "It's amazing." Victoria smiled, her heart full. "We both did it," she said. "And this is just the beginning." As the night went on, they stood together in the gallery, two artists from different generations, united by a shared journey. The fractured pieces of their lives had come together to create something whole, something beautiful. And in that moment, surrounded by the vibrant hum of creativity and connection, Victoria knew that she had finally found her way back to the artist and the teacher she was meant to be. Epilogue. Years later, a new generation of students filled the art room at Brookstone Academy. The mural Andrew had created still adorned the wall, its colors as vibrant as ever. Victoria, now the head of the school's expanded arts program, guided her students with a gentle but firm hand, encouraging them to find their own voices and embrace their imperfections. Anders' name had become well known in the art world, his work gracing galleries and public spaces across the country. Yet he never forgot where he started, often returning to Brookstone to mentor young artists and reconnect with the teacher who had once challenged and inspired him. One afternoon, as Victoria prepared for another session, she noticed a new addition to the mural, a small, vibrant butterfly painted in the corner, its wings spread wide as if ready to take flight. She smiled, recognizing Anders' touch. It was a reminder of their journey, of the power of second chances, and of the art that had brought them together. And in that quiet moment, Victoria knew that both she and Anders had found something greater than success. They had found purpose.